Yeah, so thank you, Thorsten. Thank you for giving me the opportunity to participate in the event today. And so, yeah, to come to my input for today, there's a lot of discussion right now in Europe and on different national levels on the way to go forward with data spaces. And so one thing which Christoph has already alluded to is that on the one hand, there have been data spaces already. On the other hand, they're not very visible right now, or the products or the uptake of these data spaces hasn't been as good as expected. And so then when you think about how to move forward in that situation, there is a question of how should data spaces operate together. So if we expect different countries to have their own data space, or if we expect different niches to have their own data space, how should those operate together? Is there any actual technical or legal connection between data spaces? And yeah, if you want to bring it back to a more technical discussion, which on a level which many here in the audience might be familiar with, it's similar to the question, how much infrastructure should be shared between web apps, right? Or how much infrastructure should be shared between apps for smartphone ecosystems. So, right, if we have a data space, let's say for the construction industry in Greece, how much of that should be shared with the data space for genomic data in Germany? Yeah, and this is an important question because it also influences the direction that the Trusts project will be moving in. Yeah, because the different focus on these two directions influences what the infrastructure needs to provide. And yeah, this also goes back to one of the main issues, one of the main objectives of the Trust project, which is the distinction between having Trust as a platform by itself, so in a standalone mode, or as a platform federator. Yeah, and so yeah, to also bring up a controversial idea, I would say having too many data spaces actually right now is not the problem. There should be more data spaces. There should actually be as many data spaces as possible to basically just see what works. And yeah, and then when we have these data spaces, we can identify the common patterns. We can identify the things which they all need, and we can actually establish best practices in a much better way. So that would be that aspect of scaling of data spaces. Okay, so I think then before moving to my next slide, I would just like to answer one question from the chat, which is of a more controversial nature. So Istvan is asking there how to work with or how to respond to the aspect that right now there's a strong prejudice on the consumer side against selling and profiting from data. And I think this is a very good question, and it's actually not too controversial because this is actually consumer sentiment today. There is no trust. There is no trust for selling data and for buying data. So consumers don't know what this means, and all the experience that people have with it, that consumers have with it, has been negative. And I think this actually is one of the crucial points why the Trusts project is needed, to set a positive example of how data, which has personal identifiable information, can be used as an economic commodity in a data marketplace by maintaining control of the data while also profiting from it in a monetary sense. And we don't have examples for how this is done today. And up till now, kind of the business model around data was very simple. Company aggregates data and they sell it, and the people, the individual persons who are in that data set, they don't benefit from that transaction. And so, yeah, trusts will provide, and let me just think how to say this in the best way. So trust will provide an ecosystem in which experiments around new business models that are based on personal data, but that treat the customer in a respectful way, how they can be developed, right? Okay, so I think, yeah, that's all I would like to say to answer that question. And so then I think it's Natalia presenting that slide right now. So if you just move to the next one, yeah, thank you. So what can we learn from the first generation of data market spaces? And so this hasn't been so clear, or maybe not clear enough for some of our participants. The trusts technical infrastructure will be based on both the technical infrastructure of the international data spaces and also on the data market Austria technical infrastructure. So it's a best of breed solution that is based on a strong foundation of these two existing data spaces. And so, yeah, in the preliminary discussions already, there have been many findings from these previous efforts that we expect to build on in trusts. So, yeah, it's standing on strong shoulders of the data market spaces that have come before. And I think, yeah, there was also one or two aspects there. I think now, I don't know what the first name there is. Zoe was asking about incentives for data providers. And this is one thing that is a very strong aspect of the people in the consortium, of the partners in the consortium that are looking into the business models and the legal aspects. Okay, yeah, so I think, right, we're running short of time. I would just like to focus on two more aspects, and I think these are important takeaways here, is that there has been a lot of discussion in the last few years, right before the GDPR has come into effect and right after it, if privacy regulation in Europe is an opportunity or an obstacle. And so while this discussion has been of a very theoretical nature, there have not been enough efforts to actually provide real ecosystems, so ecosystems that can be used, that are in operation, that allow experimenting with this idea, right? So if we build on top of the privacy regulation, can we not use this as a positive opportunity to provide values that are not available in an ecosystem anywhere else in the world? And I think this is something which we will be demonstrating with the Trust project. And there's another aspect of the Trust project which is very important to my vision for where trust will be going. And this is to show that if we assume data by itself has an intrinsic value, what does this mean for the future of data sovereignty? To stay in control of data as a natural or legal person, what does this mean when we assume data isn't just something that you should be able to access or not, but that this data by itself has very high value, right? And so one of the aspects of this is if the data has personal information. Another aspect of this is if you assume data had a lot of associated costs with producing it, right? So if we come back to the COVID-19 situation right now, if you think of a data set which is based on a trial of a medication, let's say of a vaccine or of any other medication for COVID-19, then this was extremely costly to produce. Now, however, to move forward with addressing the pandemic, it would be great if this data could be shared without taking away its value. And data spaces that we had so far didn't allow this to happen. And I believe with trusts, we can show how this could work in the future, right? So we could show at least one vision of how this could work. And this should stimulate the discussion on what data sovereignty could mean for the intrinsic value of data and for maintaining this even while sharing the data. Okay, so far my input. I would like to give the floor back to Thorsten to either stimulate more discussion or wrap up this call.
Thank you, Benjamin. This is really great because you already picked up the two questions here in the chat. I just want to come back to one of your statements and also the first part of the question of Zoe, data as a public good, because I mean this was implicitly answered by you. Just to make it clear, is your opinion that with this respect, data cannot be a public good because, of course, the data provider or the origin of data stays with these trusted data space under control of the use or at least the economic use, and with this the value of the data. Is this a right understanding?
Yeah, so thanks, Thorsten, for bringing that up again. And thanks again to Zoe for asking that question. Now, to talk about data as a public good assumes that this data is public, right? And so just please correct me if I'm wrong in that understanding. And so if data is public, the way that it needs to be protected is less reliant on technical means of that protection. And so I would assume this to be a special case which has been addressed by many different approaches, both technical and other approaches before. So I would consider data as a public good to be the more simple case as compared to data as something that has a value that needs to be maintained and protected. And so I would expect both trusts and other initiatives for data marketplaces in the future to always enable data as a public good by default, right? It would just mean here's some data assets. These can be used in your data marketplace, in your data space, such as trusts. But please just disable any of the protection measures that would get in the way of the public to actually make use of this data set. And so I would consider the use case of data as a public good to be solved in many ways, right? There might still be questions on which specific infrastructure to use, and maybe it's not working as well as some stakeholders might like it. However, this is more of an engineering problem, let's say today, right? So it's more of a problem of the details of how to do it and not the fundamental possibility. Whereas the question of how to maintain the value of data while still giving others access to it, that is a much more open question. And that's why it's a much bigger challenge and why that is one of the main challenges that trust is addressing.